The rope sang under the helicopter's rotors, a high metallic note against the roar of blades. Suspended beneath, a 6-foot white stone statue of the Virgin Mary twisted and swayed in the mountain wind. The pilot fought the controls, sweat rolling into his eyes. Below, on a ridge in Colorado's Front Range, families, elderly parishioners, a priest investments, and children clutching rosaries stood frozen, their prayers rising like incense in the storm. And then it happened. A violent gust struck. The sling snapped. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stop. 440 pounds of carved stone fell from the sky. That was the moment the entire town would remember. That was the moment that would divide skeptics from believers, scientists from the faithful, and leave everyone asking, what really happened that day on the mountain? Weeks earlier, no one had imagined that their faith would be tested in such a public, dangerous way. The parish of Our Lady of the Pines, a humble Catholic church perched on a pine-covered ridge, had been built over a century ago by immigrant shepherds. Weathered wood, cracked bell, pews patched together with nails and prayer, it had endured lightning, fire, and time. But now the community had grown, and the church could no longer hold them all. The decision was made. They would build a small apse, add a new bell arch, and place a statue of the Virgin Mary to watch over the valley. A donor, anonymous but deeply devout, had commissioned a sculptor in Vermont. The result was breathtaking. Mary in flowing robes, 1 foot stepping forward, her open hands extended in quiet authority, as though shielding her children from unseen harm. But there was a problem. The statue weighed over 440 pounds. The trail was narrow, nearly impassable. Mules had failed. Trucks could not climb. The only way up was through the sky. And so, for the first time in parish history, the community agreed to hire a helicopter. On the morning of the lift, they gathered at the meadow below the ridge. Father Michael Alvarez, the parish priest, stood with his stole fluttering in the wind. His sermons were simple, but always seemed to leave the congregation unsettled in the right way, like a seed planted where you didn't expect it. He looked at the statue and whispered, "Mother, keep us today." The pilot was Captain Ethan Cole, a National Guard veteran. Tall, sandy-haired, eyes narrowed against the glare. Ethan had flown missions in storms that twisted mountains into toys. But this was different. Cargo's one thing, he muttered, tightening the harness. Holy cargo is another. Ruth Delgado, a retired paramedic with a rosary wrapped twice around her hand, sat in a folding chair near the trailhead. She had seen accidents, bodies broken by gravity and glass. She prayed louder than most. Sophia Nguyen, a college sophomore who rang the chapel bell on Sundays, clutched her clipboard, trying to collect names for a donor wall. But when she looked up at the statues swinging beneath the helicopter, she froze, pencil hovering above paper. Beside her stood Deacon Thomas Reed, steady as oak, loudspeaker in hand, keeping order among restless children. And leaning against a pine with his handheld anemometer was Caleb McBride, an engineer from the nearby wind farm. He frowned at the numbers flashing on his device. The crowd waited. The helicopter roared. The statue rose. Weeks earlier, no one had imagined that their faith would be tested in such a public, dangerous way. The parish of Our Lady of the Pines, a humble Catholic church perched on a pine-covered ridge, had been built over a century ago by immigrant shepherds. Weathered wood, cracked bell, pews patched together with nails and prayer, it had endured lightning, fire, and time. But now the community had grown, and the church could no longer hold them all. The decision was made. They would build a small apse, add a new bell arch, and place a statue of the Virgin Mary to watch over the valley. A donor, anonymous but deeply devout, had commissioned a sculptor in Vermont. The result was breathtaking, Mary in flowing robes, 1 foot stepping forward, her open hands extended in quiet authority, as though shielding her children from unseen harm. But there was a problem. The statue weighed over 440 pounds. The trail was narrow, nearly impassable. Mules had failed. Trucks could not climb. The only way up was through the sky. And so, for the first time in parish history, the community agreed to hire a helicopter. On the morning of the lift, they gathered at the meadow below the ridge. Father Michael Alvarez, the parish priest, stood with his stole fluttering in the wind. His sermons were simple, but always seemed to leave the congregation unsettled in the right way, like a seed planted where you didn't expect it. He looked at the statue and whispered, "Mother, keep us today." The pilot was Captain Ethan Cole, a National Guard veteran. Tall, sandy-haired, eyes narrowed against the glare. Ethan had flown missions in storms that twisted mountains into toys. But this was different. Cargo's one thing, he muttered, tightening the harness. Holy cargo is another. Ruth Delgado, a retired paramedic with a rosary wrapped twice around her hand, sat in a folding chair near the trailhead. She had seen accidents, bodies broken by gravity and glass. She prayed louder than most. Sophia Nguyen, a college sophomore who rang the chapel bell on Sundays, clutched her clipboard, trying to collect names for a donor wall. But when she looked up at the statues swinging beneath the helicopter, she froze, pencil hovering above paper. Beside her stood Deacon Thomas Reed, steady as oak, loudspeaker in hand, keeping order among restless children. And leaning against a pine with his handheld anemometer was Caleb McBride, an engineer from the nearby wind farm. He frowned at the numbers flashing on his device. The crowd waited. The helicopter roared. The statue rose. At first, everything went according to plan. The helicopter climbed, carrying the statue above the meadow, the sunlight bouncing off the white stones so brightly it seemed to glow. Parishioners gasped, some crossing themselves, others whispering, "Look at her, she's shining." Captain Cole guided the machine carefully, keeping low enough to avoid wild swinging, high enough to clear the tops of the pines. Mason, the crew chief, gave a thumbs up as the statue swayed only slightly, like a pendulum at peace. "Beautiful sight," someone murmured. But Father Alvarez didn't smile. He knew this ridge. He had heard the wind sing through its canyons, sudden and cruel. He raised the radio to his mouth. "Captain, how's she handling?" "Fine for now," Cole replied, eyes never leaving the line. Halfway up the slope, the air began to change. First it was subtle, a whisper in the pines, a shimmer in the branches. Then dust peeled up off the fire road and swirled into the trees. Caleb's anemometer jumped. He muttered, "That's not good." He walked to the deacon. "You don't have a windsock up there?" Reed chuckled, holding the loudspeaker. "We have a bell. It rings when the wind shifts. Works fine." But then the bell did ring once. Startled, unbidden, a low hum rose across the ridge, as if the forest itself was warning them. The helicopter wobbled slightly. Cole corrected. The statues swung wider, steadied. People held their breath. From the valley, dark clouds gathered. Not in the slow way of summer storms, but fast, coiling, like a snake preparing to strike. And then, on the ridge, a woman cried out, pointing to the sky, "Look!" From the cloud edge, a thin dark column twisted downward, a dust devil, a mountain funnel, not wide but vicious. It snaked toward the helicopter like a finger of chaos. "Captain, Rotation below you, Alvarez shouted into the radio. I see it. Cole snapped. Pulling on the collective. The helicopter bucked, fighting to climb. But the wind had other plans. It shoved sideways, pressing against the machine like an unseen hand. The statues swung violently. The rope groaned. Mason's knuckles whitened. Below, parishioners clutched one another. Children buried faces into mothers' coats. Ruth's rosary beads rattled in her lap as she prayed. Hail Mary, full of grace. The pilot gritted his teeth. Hold steady. Hold steady. But the funnel had found its toy. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to process. Too slow to ever forget. The sling struck the shackle at a bad angle. Metal kissed metal. The backup line tightened, screamed like an animal, and snapped. The main sling unclipped. And then, the statue was falling. 440 pounds of stone, spinning through 30 meters of air, surrounded by a howl of wind and prayer. Some later swore they saw the statue glow. Others said they heard nothing but silence. Children remembered their parents' gasps. Adults remembered thinking, this is the end of it. The statue plummeted. It spun once in the air. Robes and hands turned toward the mountain as if Mary herself were bracing for the impact. Gasps broke out across the ridge. But not a single scream. It was as though everyone's breath had been stolen at the same time. The world narrowed into one point, stone against earth. Instead of a shattering explosion, instead of marble fragments scattering across pine needles, the sound was soft. A hollow thump. Like two stones knocking together inside a cavern. Dust puffed around the base. And then silence. For 3 endless seconds. No one moved. The helicopter climbed away, steadying itself above the trees, as if relieved of its burden. The funnel roared briefly through a stand of brush below the ridge, then dissipated like smoke in the wind. On the ridge, Father Alvarez felt his knees weaken. He walked forward, parting the crowd as though they had rehearsed this moment, until he stood only a few feet away. The statue stood upright, entirely intact, in the shallow bed of pine duff and rocky soil. Not a chip, not a crack. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the hem of the stone gown. It was cool, steady, as though nothing unusual had happened. Behind him, Ruth fell to her knees, her rosary clattering to the dirt. It can't be, she whispered. Her lips resumed their prayers, but now her words were filled with tears. Children, clutching their parents' arms, peeked out. Sophia, the student, dropped her clipboard and covered her mouth, eyes wide with awe. Deacon Reed lowered the loudspeaker and crossed himself slowly. It was Caleb, the engineer, who broke the silence. That is not possible. His voice shook, not with faith but with confusion. He crouched, examining the base, brushing away dust. He muttered about load distribution, angles of impact, soil elasticity, probability. But none of his words erased the truth before him. A 440-pound statue had fallen nearly 100 feet and had not even chipped. Father Alvarez bent low, pressed his forehead against the statue's base, and whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. His voice was thick, uneven, but it carried across the ridge. One by one, the people followed. Elderly men with aching joints, young mothers with children in their arms, construction workers, fire crew members all came forward. Some touched the stone with reverent hands. Others simply knelt in the pine needles. No one spoke of science or accident. In that moment, all that mattered was that what should have been destroyed was standing. Down in the meadow, Ethan Cole landed the helicopter, shutting down the blades. He sat in silence, helmet still on his head, staring at the mountain ridge. Mason, the crew chief, finally spoke. I checked that line twice. It wasn't supposed to fail. Ethan removed his helmet, his face pale. I've seen vehicles crushed under less. That statue should be rubble. He exhaled slowly. You can call it what you want. But up there, something happened. Without another word, he began the hike up the ridge. By late afternoon, the statue had been carefully carried into its intended niche. Volunteers used straps and blocks, working quietly, almost as though speaking too loudly might break the spell. When the stone was finally settled into place, a collective sigh passed through the crowd. As the sun dipped, people refused to leave. Candles appeared brought from backpacks, pulled from purses, borrowed from the chapel. They placed them at the statue's feet. A guitar surfaced, its strings a little out of tune, but the player strummed anyway. A hymn rose, shaky at first, then strong. Hail, Holy Queen enthroned above. The ridge glowed with candlelight. The statue's white surface caught the flames and turned golden. People began to speak aloud, giving testimony. I was sure I would watch it break, and my heart broke first. I prayed harder in those seconds than I have in years. My son asked me if angels caught her, and I couldn't say no. Even Caleb, still crouched with his instrument, admitted softly, I don't believe in miracles, but I can't explain what I saw. No one argued with him. They didn't need to. 2 days later, a local news station sent a reporter. A young woman with a microphone stood in front of the statue, recording reactions. She asked Father Alvarez, "Do you believe this was a miracle?" He looked directly at the camera. "What I believe," he said carefully, "is that God does not waste moments. Whether this statue stands because of physics, chance, or the hand of heaven, the fact is that it has changed hearts. That is the greater miracle." The clip aired that night across Colorado, then spread online. Comments raged. It's just luck. No statue should survive that. Proof that God protects his people. Faith over physics nonsense. Debate only fueled interest. Pilgrims began to arrive. Some came to pray, some to gawk, some to argue. But all left with the image burned into their minds, a statue that fell and did not break. That week, Caleb McBride couldn't sleep. Numbers swam in his head: weight, distance, angle, probability. He ran simulations on his laptop, but each scenario ended in destruction. He walked the ridge at dawn, crouched by the impact site, measured soil compression, studied roots and rocks. One evening he admitted to Ruth, "It's keeping me awake. Not because I want to prove it wrong, but because I can't." Ruth smiled gently. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe you're not supposed to explain everything. Maybe you're just supposed to wonder." Caleb frowned but didn't argue. For the first time, he placed his palm against the statue's base and whispered, "Show me what this means." Among the visitors was a man in his 40s. Weary eyes. Wedding ring absent. He had driven up from Denver after hearing the story on the news. He carried with him a folded stack of eviction notices and a small stuffed toy his daughter had left behind. He stood before the statue as the sun set, shadows stretching long. His voice broke as he said, "If this is real, if you are real, help me find my way back." No angel touched his shoulder. No voice answered. But when he walked down the mountain that night, he called his daughter. He promised her he would not miss the school play again. For him, that was miracle enough. By Sunday, the chapel was overflowing. Mass spilled into the meadow. Families kneeling on blankets and camp chairs. Father Alvarez preached with a quiet fire. "We do not worship stone. We worship the God who can make the unbreakable stand, Even when everything says it should fall, our world is filled with storms, injustice, and violence. But this statue is a sign that nothing is wasted. Not even a fall. Not even your fall. The congregation erupted in amens. Tears streaked faces hardened by years of labor and loss. The statue shone in the evening sun. Hands outstretched. Gaze steady. Perfect. Here is part 3:1. 200 words of the narration. This section covers the scientific investigation, the debate between faith and reason, and builds toward the community's resolution. By Monday morning, official vehicles appeared in the gravel lot at the base of the ridge. 2 men in county polos and baseball caps carried clipboards, tape measures, and a rangefinder. They were polite but clinical, speaking in short, clipped sentences. Helicopter incident. One said, "We need to file a report." Parishioners guided them up the trail. On the ridge, they measured the distance from the niche to the impact site, scribbling notes about soil depth, root density, and slope incline. They snapped photos from every angle. To them, it was an incident. To the townspeople, it was still a miracle. The contrast was almost comic. Parishioners knelt with rosaries while inspectors crouched with calipers. One woman muttered, "They'll never see it the way we do." Another whispered, "They don't need to. We saw it." That afternoon, a white SUV climbed the mountain road, carrying Dr. Anita Sloan, a meteorologist from the State University. Her hair, silver as fresh snow, was pulled back in a neat bun. She wore hiking boots and carried a small anemometer, barometer, and notebook. She introduced herself with a brisk handshake. "I'm not here to disprove anything," she assured the priest. "I'm here to understand." For the next 2 hours, she studied the ridge like an artist surveying a canvas. She explained air currents, downdrafts, and the quirks of mountain weather. "Air is like water," she told the crowd. "It flows, swirls, tumbles. Sometimes it carves funnels, like wrung towels." "That's what you saw." She crouched by the impact site. "Now, look here. The base of this statue, see how it flares outward? That spreads the load when it lands. And this pine duff? 2 inches of cushion. Doesn't sound like much, but it absorbs energy." People leaned closer, listening as though she were delivering a sermon. Dr. Sloan spun her hand like a child's toy top. "If the statue spun during the fall, it may have rolled slightly on impact, dispersing the force, like dropping a bottle sideways instead of straight down." She paused, looking around at the faces, many skeptical, many hopeful. "Physics doesn't deny mystery," she said softly. "Sometimes, the way the variables align feels improbable enough to take your breath away." Her words hung in the air, a bridge between reason and faith. That evening, Caleb McBride sat on the chapel steps with Ruth. His anemometer lay forgotten at his feet. "I've been running the numbers again," he admitted. "Soil elasticity, rotational momentum, base geometry. It adds up barely. But even when it does, I still feel something I can't name." Ruth smiled, her rosary in her lap. "Maybe that feeling is prayer." He chuckled. "I don't pray." "Then maybe it's time to learn." For the first time since the incident, Caleb didn't argue. He simply sat, eyes on the statue, and whispered into the cooling dusk, "If you're there, help me make sense of this." Not everyone agreed. As the story spread online, the ridge filled with visitors, pilgrims, skeptics, journalists, curious hikers. Some came to pray, some came to scoff. One evening, a small group gathered around the statue, candles glowing against the stone. A young man with glasses and a skeptical grin challenged Father Alvarez directly. "This wasn't a miracle," he said. "It's physics and luck. If you call this divine, you cheapen real faith." The priest folded his hands. "And yet you're here." The young man flushed. "I came to see what the fuss was about." "And what do you see?" Alvarez asked. He hesitated. His eyes flicked to the statue, flawless under flickering candlelight. "I see people believing. Sometimes," Alvarez said gently. "That is the miracle." At Friday's vigil, Captain Ethan Cole finally returned. He stood near the statue, arms crossed, face weathered from years of flying into storms. "I've flown sling loads heavier than this," he said quietly to the crowd. "I know what happens when a line fails. It's never pretty. Cargo shatters. Equipment's lost. People get hurt." He shook his head slowly. "But this statue? It should not be standing. I can't explain it. I'm not sure I want to. All I know is, in that moment, I thought I'd just witnessed disaster. Instead, I witnessed grace." His words drew silence. Then applause. Then tears. A week later, the bishop himself arrived. In white vestments, he processed with incense and holy water, blessing the statue and the new apse. His homily was short but powerful. We are not promised that storms will pass us by. We are not promised freedom from injustice or violence. But we are promised that nothing is wasted in God's hands. This statue is not prophet's reminder. A reminder that what falls can stand again. The crowd erupted in amens. The statue glowed in the afternoon sun, candles flickering at its base. That evening, after the bishop departed, a man lingered alone, middle-aged, weary, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He laid a small stuffed toy at the statue's feet. His voice trembled. "If this is real," he said, "help me be better. Help me come home." No thunder answered. No voice spoke. But when he walked down the ridge, he pulled out his phone and called his daughter. It was the first time in months. For him, the miracle had already begun. The town buzzed with conversation. Some argued heatedly over coffee in diners. "It's just coincidence." "No, it's proof. Faith doesn't need proof." Others debated online, comment sections swelling with fury and faith alike. But on the ridge, the statue stood silent, hands outstretched. Sophia, writing in her journal, captured the feeling best. It doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is that we were changed. We saw stone fall, and it taught us to stand. 2 weeks later, the ridge looked transformed. What had once been a muddy clearing was now swept and prepared. Benches hauled up on the backs of volunteers. Canvas tents pitched for shade. A wooden altar stood beneath the statue, draped in white linen embroidered with Marian blue. Word had spread far beyond the county. Cars lined the dirt road below. License plates from Kansas, Nebraska, New Mexico, even Texas. Families carried coolers and lawn chairs up the trail. Elderly women in shawls leaned on the arms of younger relatives. Teenagers lugged speakers and hymnals. It was no ordinary Sunday. It was a dedication mass. Father Alvarez, flanked by Deacon Reed, lifted his eyes toward the statue as the choir began the opening hymn, Immaculate Mary. Hundreds of voices rose into the mountain air, carrying over the pine trees, echoing against the cliffs. For a brief moment, even the birds seemed to fall silent. Before the readings, Alvarez invited parishioners to step forward and share what the statue's survival meant to them. First came Ruth, clutching her rosary. "I've lived on this mountain my whole life," she said, her voice steady though her hands shook. "I've buried a husband here. I've raised children here. I've prayed for miracles and wondered why they never came. But now I see it wasn't that God was absent. It was that he was waiting for me to look up. Applause rippled through the crowd. Next was Caleb, the engineer. He cleared his throat, unfolded a paper, then abandoned it. I thought numbers explained everything. When the statue fell, I ran the equations. But no math could ease what I felt here. He pressed his fist to his chest. That unease turned into something I didn't expect: hope. I can't prove it, but I can't deny it either. Maybe that's what faith begins with. Gasps. Then quiet nods. Even Ethan Cole, the pilot, spoke. I've carried soldiers, supplies, even coffins in that chopper. I know weight, lift, wind. But I also know what I saw. Something should have shattered. And it didn't. That's not just mechanics. That's mercy. Every testimony added a new thread to the tapestry. Some spoke of broken families healing. Others of despair lifted. Each voice was different. But the refrain was the same: we were changed. When it was time, Father Alvarez climbed the altar steps. His voice rang with a strength born not of volume but of conviction. We are a people who know storms. He began. Storms in the sky. Storms in our homes. Storms in our hearts. Some of you know the storm of addiction. Others, the storm of poverty. Others, the storm of violence that leaves scars too deep to name. And we know how fragile we are in the face of those storms. But today, we are reminded of something deeper. What falls does not always break. This statue stood not to prove stone is strong, but to prove faith is stronger. The congregation broke into applause, rising to its feet. Some shouted amen. Others raised their hands. Others wept silently. After communion, a man stepped hesitantly into the line. He was unfamiliar, rumpled jacket, hands rough, eyes weary. When he reached the chalice, Father Alvarez met his gaze. The man whispered, "It's been 20 years." The priest simply nodded, offering the cup. The man drank, tears spilling down his cheeks. Later, he knelt at the statue, pressing his forehead against the stone. He left without giving his name. But many noticed the peace in his shoulders as he descended the mountain. Night fell gently. The dedication mass ended. But no one wanted to leave. Candles were lit again, passed from hand to hand until the ridge glowed like a galaxy. The people formed a circle around the statue. Hymns rose, Ave Maria, Salve Regina. Children carried small lanterns, their laughter ringing even as their parents sang. The statue gleamed in the candlelight, flawless, serene. It was not just stone. It was a symbol, a story, a sermon no words could contain. Not everyone sang. On the far edge of the crowd, a group of college students debated in low voices. "It's all theatrics," one muttered. "But you saw it." Another argued. "Physics explains it." Maybe. But faith explains why it matters. They never reached agreement. But even in their doubt, they were part of the story now. Their arguments another layer in the living miracle. Just before midnight, the bishop raised his hand in blessing. "May this statue remind you, what falls can stand, what breaks can heal, what storms can be endured. Go in peace, and be witnesses to the God who makes the impossible possible." Candles lifted high. Voices rang out. The ridge felt less like earth and more like sanctuary. Long after the crowd dispersed, Father Alvarez lingered alone. He placed his hand on the statue's base and whispered, "Thank you." The wind rustled through the pines. The stars blazed overhead. The statue stood silent, as though keeping watch. For Alvarez, the miracle was no longer about physics or chance. It was about transformation. A town once fractured by hardship now stood united. A people once bowed under storms now lifted their eyes. He turned, shoulders heavy with exhaustion but light with joy, and began the walk down the mountain.